just really, C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills began to impact on young intellectuals everywhere. A periodical later appeared, greatly inspired by him, called Studies on the Left, in which many of the new left intellectuals, and by no means were all of them intellectuals, let me make it plain, but people who felt that a new left had to be formed, since the old left was now completely dead, it seemed, began to debate the theoretical issues involved in what was ultimately to lead to the Port Huron Statement of 1964, as well as still other documents that appeared. So one began to get a sense of an intellectual ferment beginning to emerge through periodicals like Studies on the Left. One began to get a sense of a grassroots movement stirring, and such as Women's Strike for Peace, which tragically, or whatever, history may pass its own verdict on this question, faded away. As I said, I just recently encountered I don't know if I said it, but I recently encountered a book on Women's Strike for Peace, which I'm very eager to read, since most of the women I knew were very active in it, and thus indirectly I had my own, function, how shall I put it, offering suggestions and so on and so forth to the women whom I knew. And many of them fell back on me, partly because I had a long experience in the labor movement and in the communist movement of the 1930s, in fact, in the old left. Tragically, I'm sorry to say, many of the old left radicals who were still around were not offering any advice to anybody. They were sitting on with a sense of contentment on their role in the 1930s, and their horizons had not expanded much beyond that of the old labor movement, which was now beginning to wane or play a less significant role in anything that could be called radicalism. So, considering the intellectual ferment and the grassroots activist ferment, the conditions were slowly being laid for the emergence of a new left, and for the emergence of still other new types of movements. And still further, blacks began, people in the South, African Americans in the South, began to stir as well. And I don't remember when it was, be it 1960 or whatever, 60 literally, 4 or so African American students, black students in the South, occupied a portion of a lunch counter in Woolworth's. I think it was in Greensboro. And that immediately set off a tremendous, it was a spark that lit kindling. Rosa Parks refused to sit in a segregated area of a bus, and that too added still other sparks to the kindling that was piling up, because blacks expected to have their appropriate place in American society. Thus far, all of this was in the framework of the capitalist system, one must understand. Nobody was still challenging capitalism as such, and nobody was challenging explicitly hierarchy as such. But as this kindling and as the sparks fell on it began to increase in number, incident by incident, it patently became clear that a broad civil rights movement, very broad in its horizon, emerged. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as we used to call it, and I think as whatever is left of the movement, at least the personalities who played a major role in it, called the movement, began to take an active role. Black students began to take an active role in trying to enfranchise the enormous number of black tenant farmers. You still had a very sizable number of tenant farmers in the South, sharecroppers, and the like, and small communities that lived on a near subsistence level, particularly in places like Mississippi, but certainly all through the South. The integration of the schools was an enormous factor in stirring sentiments among blacks and whites. And finally, as the civil rights movement began to take form, and the form that it took, I must stress this, was a very special humanistic form. Blacks, in a sense, were fighting for everybody, not only for black rights. At least so many of their spokespersons declared publicly, Martin Luther King in particular, speaking of the unity of blacks and whites and of all oppressed peoples. We began to see in this an increasingly radicalized movement and an increasingly radicalizing force in American society. In the meantime, students who had been involved in the civil rights movement, white students who had been involved in the Mississippi Summer and in helping to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and some of whom were martyred in that struggle in Mississippi. One of them, Mickey Schwerner, for example, who was I think in my core chapter at that time. Again, memory is not always reliable, but I know that we were deeply involved in CORE when I joined CORE, because Mickey Schwerner in particular had been one of our members. He was one of the 3 blacks who were killed. I mean, of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed, one of whom was black, Cheney. Began to produce a greater sense of ferment. Students coming back from the Mississippi Summer were deeply moved by the experience. They were whites, they were privileged, they were middle class, and some of them even upper class, who felt more and more that things had to change in the United States. And the Port Huron statement articulated these sentiments. It didn't create them, it articulated them, but then went on to spread the ferment as a statement. More and more people read it, and not only students. I remember it when it appeared in a kind of mimeographed form and later appeared in a brown pamphlet, which was very widely circulated. And it opened up a whole perspective for social change. So the new left now began to take form, and almost self-consciously so. Periodicals were calling themselves New Left. SDS's internal publication was called New Left Notes. The studies on the left began to take on a very distinct New Left turn. In Britain, the New Left, I think it was Review, I'm not sure of the title, began to appear. And the word New Left now became a very commonly used expression. Now, this New Left was populist, radical populist, in a sense not unlike the old populist movement in Russia back in the 19th century. It went to the people. Its goal was to go to the people, and particularly, of course, to reach the enormous student body that had emerged in the United States, where going to college prior to the Second World War was a kind of upper class or middle class privilege, which involved only a small proportion of the student body. The most you could hope to attain, at least among working class people, was a high school diploma, which was then highly respected because of the curriculum was far more intensive than it is today. Now, millions of people, owing to the war, the post-war period of affluence and the GI Bill and whatever you like, began to go to college. And the idea of having a college diploma, at least an undergraduate diploma, was regarded as an absolute necessity for getting into the American mainstream. So we had at least, I would say, 7 million college students. That's a whole population. We're not talking now of a small segment of the population or just one limited privileged group. We're talking of a whole population. And then there were community colleges, you see, and they numbered X numbers of millions, you know what I mean, who were just below the official college level, and many people went from community colleges into regular colleges. So we had this enormous student population. And student issues became very important and intermingled with social issues.